All right. Well, thank you for joining us again for the second part, second presentation. I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Wilson Kenney, who's going to be providing information about problematic sexual behavior. I usually do intros of our guests, but I'm going to let, if you don't mind, I'm going to let Dr. Kenney introduce himself. He's got a great PowerPoint deck as well. And Dr. Kenney, just on our side, you got 8 communities that are funded through the OJJDP grant. We have Austin, Texas, Spokane, Washington, Lancaster County, South Carolina, Broward County, Florida, Chester, Pennsylvania, Lompoc and El Rancho, California, and Laconia, New Hampshire. So sizes from very small to very large. So with that, Dr. Kenney, I'll give you the floor.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here and talk to everyone today. My focus is going to be talking about problematic sexual behavior in schools. And as we're going through, if you have questions, please just jump in. We're also going to save some time at the end for questions as well. But by all means, if there's something that's unclear, or you want me to talk more about anything that we're going through here, just let me know. So start out with a little disclaimer about how this was funded. So basically this comes through a grant through the OJJDP. So a little bit about who I am. So this gives kind of a list of some of the things that I'm doing.
Real quick, Dr. Kenney, you want to share your screen now?
Yeah, is that not coming through?
It didn't come through yet.
Oh no, let me try that again. Boy, you guys are missing some pretty amazing slides too. So yeah,
those are the best.
Yeah. All right.
There we are.
Okay. All right.
Perfect.
So I think this is the one you guys missed.
Yes, most important one.
All right. Yeah, there we go. Most important. How this is all funded. So there's the information about that. Okay, so who am I? I'm a clinical psychologist. I live in Oregon, and most of the work that I do right now is forensically oriented. So mostly it's forensic assessment. But prior to that, and the reason why I'm coming to talk to you guys today is prior to that, I worked in schools as a school psychologist for several years. And in that capacity, I did some work with the folks down in Salem-Keizer. Those of you who are active in schools are probably aware of the Salem-Keizer model. They created kind of the gold standard with regard to threat response. And when I met the fellow who started that program, John Van Driel, probably about 12 years ago, he and I had a conversation about how they needed some kind of threat response that would address problematic sexual behavior. And so that was what my background was in terms of the work I'd done in graduate school. And so they hired me to create a model. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. It comes from the work that I did down there. Just so you know, I'm still very active in schools. I provide consultation to schools about how to implement this model. And my wife's a school administrator. They use this model in her school district as well. So I am trying to keep abreast of all the stuff that's going on in schools, even though most of my work is forensically oriented right now. So funny story about who I am. I coach my kids' soccer teams. And before I started my first year of coaching, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, my wife was like, we ought to go and Google your name and see what comes up when people Google Wilson Kenney, because people are going to want to know who's coaching their kids' soccer team. Well, at the time, the thing that came up was this: Wilson Kenney, balding creeper busted for exposing penis to teen lifeguard. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is horrible, right? That was like the first 3 searches that came up was all about this. And then it was like, it kind of died down and I was like, okay. And then unfortunately it became a meme. And then this thing got kind of passed around all over the place. So I'm not that Wilson Kenney, and you can see this face is not that face. I just want to make sure if you Google me, I'm not that guy. All right, so trigger warnings, things we're going to be talking about today. I'll obviously be referring to sex and sexuality and sexual assault and sexual trauma. I'll talk about physical and sexual abuse and about sexual anatomy. So these topics can be upsetting and triggering for some individuals, and just be mindful of your own experience as you're going through this. If you need a break, take a break. It certainly can be a little bit more intense, but we are going to be talking about sexual behavior, specifically how it presents in schools. You should also know I wrote a book about this, this approach. I'll talk to you a little bit about that toward the end, just give some ideas about supervision strategies and how to identify kids with problematic sexual behaviors. It's written really specifically for schools. And as I mentioned, I also provide consultation to schools and other agencies about problematic sexual behavior. So I want to start out with some case vignettes to sort of orient everybody to what this is about, in case you are maybe new to thinking about problematic sexual behavior in school. So this first example is Franklin. He is age 6, so he's a kindergartner. And I use this as an example whenever I do my lectures, because in my mind, this is kind of the very lowest sort of situation that you might ever encounter that might encourage you to be more curious. So I try to bring it as an example to just give you a sense for like how even the smallest things can be things that lead to bigger things. And so it's to our own interest to make sure that we are attending to these little things when they come up. So Franklin is 6 years old. He has been peeing in the bark dust, which I discovered is a regional thing. Sometimes it's also known as mulch, but it's the stuff that's on playgrounds, the wood chips that are on playgrounds. So Franklin comes to school, he's peeing in the bark dust, he's peeing in the mulch, and teachers become concerned. As you're sitting there, I'm sure you all can think of like a bunch of different reasons why Franklin might be peeing in the bark dust, right? And some of those reasons are really benign, right? Especially in rural communities, it's not uncommon for parents to let their kids just go out in the backyard to pee. And it may be that this is just a skill that that Franklin has learned at home that now he is bringing into school, and it's not working out quite as well for him. But there could be other things as well, right? But if you're running into a situation where you've got a kid who is presenting with this kind of behavior, peeing in the bark dust, it is in your best interest to be curious about what underlies that behavior. So it might be the gateway for you to begin to ask some questions. In Franklin's example, we start to ask some questions. Some of those questions might be, in a conversation with parents, is this going on at home? Does he pee in the bark dust at home? Some of those conversations might be more related to the physical qualities about what's going on with Franklin. So maybe he has a urinary tract infection, or maybe there's some other issue for him that's making it challenging for him to not pee in the bark dust when he's out on the playground at school, right? So it may be that there's a very benign reason for this, but it behooves you to be interested and to be curious, right? So after a couple of maybe interventions with the parents and conversations, we notice that Franklin is also engaging in frauderism. Now, I'm assuming some of you are familiar with this word, but for those of you who aren't, it's a fancy French word. And all it refers to is people who are rubbing their genitals against others for satisfaction. It might be rubbing against someone else, might be rubbing against a desk chair, things of that order. But with Franklin, even though we've tried a couple of things with mom and dad to figure out what's going on with the bark dust, after a couple of weeks, we notice he's also engaging in frauderism. So again, might encourage you to be a little bit more curious, maybe ask some more questions. It's not necessarily that this is going to be a sexually based situation yet. It may be, again, that he's still got some kind of infection, or there's some itching or some other medical reason that's causing that. But a couple of weeks later, we noticed that he tried to touch a girl's butt during circle time, okay? And now we've got a very clear indicator that there's some other element that's going on. So this is a common kind of a situation that we see all the time in kindergartens around the state here. And it's a good indicator that Franklin's going to need a higher level of intervention than maybe what we might typically involve ourselves in. And we're going to talk today specifically about what that level might look like. One of the things that you might notice as we're going through this discussion with Franklin is that each time we keep trying these things, we're noticing it's not working, it's not working, it's not working, right? And I always say that good assessment is good treatment is good assessment, right? So whenever we attempt to do something, we should be looking and seeing how did it impact the response that we got. And if we notice that the changes that we were hoping for are not being made, that tells us we need to continue to be increasingly more curious. So here's another example. And these are all examples that are taken from actual cases. So Justin, age 16, sophomore in high school, teacher discovers a journal in which Justin described his plan for kidnapping and raping a classmate. So this is very different than Franklin, right? We've got a clear threat here, a clear concern about problematic sexual behavior. As you're sitting at home or wherever you are right now at your office, think about like, how might you respond? What types of things might you be curious about Justin based upon this behavior, right? What are some things we might want to know about him? So one of the things that might be important to know about him is what's going on in his academic universe, right? What might we be able to find out about him academically that would help us have more understanding? And when we look around his academic universe, one of the things that we notice right away is that Justin has been identified by special education as being on the autism spectrum disorder. That might be important information in this context because it could help us understand a little bit about why he's become so ruminative and focused on these things. And again, this model will help you as a group make decisions about how and when to intervene in cases like you might encounter with Justin. Here's another example we've got. So Eric and Charles, both 16, they're found naked and engaged in oral sexual contact in the locker room by a teacher. Eric, who was receiving oral sexual contact from Charles at the time, reported that he was the victim in this situation, right? And so you can imagine how you might begin to initially marshal a response in order to try to protect one individual, and maybe you start thinking about the other individual as the person who's being the instigator in the situation. When we dig a little deeper, we find that Eric comes from a particularly religious household in which he's going to be in trouble at home if he's engaging in any kind of not straight sexual behavior, right? And so you start to realize maybe this might be more multi-layered. These problems can get very complicated. And oftentimes I think the old ways that we've thought about things in terms of like perpetrator and victim, oftentimes it's not particularly well suited to the kinds of issues that come up and the problematic sexual behaviors that we see in kids in schools. Sometimes these things are more nuanced, right? And so this system that I'm going to talk to you about today will also help provide strategies for how to address the situation that Eric and Charles find themselves in and provide a solution that's going to be helpful and equitable and consider all the players involved in the situation. Okay, so that's all to just kind of orient you. Let's talk a little bit about how problematic sexual behavior in schools is relevant to sexual health and health in general, right? So there's a lot of evidence out there that most adults with problematic sexual behavior struggled with problematic sexual behavior in childhood. So we know there's a connection for a lot of adults with problematic sexual behavior that these things started early on. So early intervention seems to be a key in terms of reducing the likelihood that adults are going to be harming others as they grow up and mature. We know that problematic sexual behavior is more common in children who have been maltreated, particularly kids who've been physically abused. I'm sure a lot of you know this, but physical abuse is actually a much better predictor and stronger predictor of problematic sexual behavior than is sexual victimization as a child. So we know that if kids are presenting with problematic sexual behavior, the likelihood that they're having other kinds of issues in their life that might be leading to the development of these issues is a lot higher. We know that kids with problematic sexual behavior, they're more likely to become adults with mental health and substance issues. We know kids with PSB who receive treatment are at no greater risk than typical adults to harm others sexually later on in life. So we know that intervention can be a really wonderful solution. We just have to be able to have a mechanism to identify kids with a behavior so that we can get them the intervention they need. So early intervention identification seems to be a real key in terms of preserving the sexual health of these kids. Plus, anecdotally, as any of you know, if you've worked with kids with problematic sexual behavior, most of these kids just need some direction, right? They're really lacking direction. And if you can intervene with them and provide them some structure and some safety and some methods for developing relationships with others, they're eager to participate in those things and they're going to benefit from them. So why look in schools, right? We know that problematic sexual behavior happens out in the community. Why are schools a good spot to look for it? Well, that's where the kids are, right? They're in schools more than they are anywhere else. And so it makes sense that we have some sort of mechanism to identify kids who are struggling with problematic sexual behavior and then the environments where they are most of the time, right? We also know that schools need a means of addressing problematic sexual behavior because of FAPE, right? Free access to public education. It's a wonderful law. And what it means is that everybody deserves an education. Now, when I was a kid, very many years ago, when you got suspended or expelled from school, like you were actually suspended or expelled from school. But thanks to FAPE, we still are providing education to kids, even if they've gotten themselves into such a situation that they can no longer be in their regular public school, right? So we've got to have a mechanism to be able to meet the needs of all these kids, regardless of whether or not they're struggling with problematic sexual behavior. It's also important because schools are consistent providers of oversight and supervision, right? So if we've got a kid who's struggling with problematic sexual behavior or with violent behavior, right? What we want more than anything is to keep them in an environment where they're going to be able to receive the best supervision. And that environment is schools. So it's to our own best interest and to the interest of the kids who are struggling with these behaviors that we keep them in school so that we can help them get their needs met, and also make sure that they're getting the kind of supervision that they require. We also know that schools, because they have so much access to kids, they are going to be much more likely to be able to capture the early indicators of problematic sexual behavior. We just need to make sure that the teachers and the people who work in schools have the education they need to be able to identify those kids. And we know that schools have a lot of pre-existing systems that allow for communication between the community and law enforcement and juvenile justice and all those kinds of things. So they've already got this network of communication that's set up. So it seems like it's an ideal environment in which to try to position ourselves to identify kids with concerning or problematic sexual behavior. Okay. All right, so how prevalent is it in schools? So this is based upon the data that we got out of Salem Kaiser when I was working there. So that's a district of about 40,000 kids. And in that district, about 200 to 250 reported incidents of problematic sexual behavior occurred over the course of the school year. So that's quite a lot, right? It may not be quite a lot in terms of the percentage of the population that's there, but in terms of like the busyness of having to identify and address all that problematic sexual behavior, that's certainly a lot of work for schools to deal with an additional 200 and 250 cases coming up over the course of the year. I think it's kind of interesting when you look at the data here too, to see where those reports are coming from, right? The majority of those reports are coming from elementary school and middle school. So what that's telling us is that you're getting lots of really great indicators early on when kids are struggling with problematic sexual behavior. We just need to find a mechanism to make sure that those kids are getting the support and the intervention that they need so it doesn't become more serious later on, right? But clearly, the need is there, and we're getting lots of evidence that kids, even as in elementary and middle school, are evidencing that kind of problematic sexual behavior that needs to get addressed. So how serious is a concern? Well, in the system that I'm going to talk to you about today, we kind of have different levels of concern. And in approximately 70 to 80 of the 200 and 250 cases were considered serious enough that some level of consultation was needed in order to address the required concern. Now, it's interesting, again, when you look at the numbers here, right? The majority, even though the minority of cases are coming from high school, those are the majority of the cases that require secondary, some level of consultation in the community, right? Those issues in high school, they tend to be more severe. They tend to be more acute. They tend to require a higher degree of supervision. Whereas if you look at the data, what it's suggesting here is that elementary and middle school, in most cases, those problems can be addressed by the schools themselves without any need for additional consultation or additional support outside of what the school would normally get. So it's really, I think it's really hopeful. And that what it tells me is that most of the problems that we see with problematic sexual behavior can be addressed relatively easily by a school, provided that school is educated and has a systematic way of thinking about and addressing problematic behavior, right? It's only going to be a small percentage of cases that schools really need additional support for. And we'll talk about what that looks like a little bit later on. Okay, so when problematic sexual behavior arises, schools need to be able to protect the community. They need to be able to help kids access the curriculum at school, right? That's part of FAPE. They've got to be able to protect the reputations of all the kids involved, not just the identified victims, right? But also the kids who are struggling with problematic sexual behavior. We know that a lot of these kids are experiencing a lot of shame to begin with, and we really don't want to create more shame for them by having to go through this process, right? We want to try to provide a supportive environment in which they're not going to feel like as if they're being singled out or they're being shamed because of this. So it's really important that we have a mechanism to protect reputations, but also too, we got to have a means to manage liability, right? As soon as a school knows about some sort of problematic sexual behavior, they've got to have a mechanism to address it, because to know something and do nothing is problematic. So in order to meet these goals, schools really need to have some sort of an unbiased and equity-based mechanism to identify and manage kids with problematic sexual behavior. And that's what I'll be talking to you guys about. So when do schools have an obligation to act? So here are some situations that would tell you, yes, the school must do something. So obviously, when the problematic sexual behavior occurs at school, schools got to do something. If there's any kind of physical evidence, right, sexting or pornography or things of that order, school has to respond. If the school staff is informed about problematic sexual behavior or threats occurring in the school or the community as well, school has a responsibility to respond. Now, this is kind of a new way of thinking, right? When I was in school, you didn't get in trouble for stuff you did outside of school, right? The kegger that you went to on a Friday afternoon, if the school found out about it, they weren't necessarily going to punish you. Your parents might, but the school wouldn't. But things have really changed in terms of the way schools think about those things, but particularly with regard to threat, right? So let's think for a moment if we were talking about violent threat, right? If you knew a kid was building a bomb in their home outside of school and the school found out about that, it would be really unwise for the school to have a position of, well, that occurred outside of school, therefore we're not going to respond, right? Any intelligent system is going to understand that the concern might be that that kid would bring that bomb to school. And when you think about it, it's not a bad metaphor for problematic sexual behavior, right? If a kid is struggling with problematic sexual behavior in the community, we don't want them to bring that bomb to school. So if we have information about it, that it's occurring in the community, the school has an obligation to react and respond to that information as a way of making sure that that situation doesn't come up and present at school as well. Whenever some sort of problematic behavior is causing disruption in the school activity, so if it's a distraction to other kids or other kids are bothered by it, the school has an obligation to act. If there's a history of problematic sexual behavior or threatening behavior. So even if that kid is not necessarily exhibiting that now, let's say they're coming into your district from another environment and they have a history of problematic sexual behavior, schools need to know so that they can adequately prepare and provide support for the kids who need it. Whenever there's staff, parent, or students that perceive the problematic sexual behavior as threatening behavior or unusual or odd or inappropriate, schools have an obligation to react. So if it becomes something that's distracting people from the work of school, schools need to do something about it. And again, whenever an administrator is unable to assert that a concern is unfounded, they've got to have an obligation to act as well. So like I mentioned earlier, if you have knowledge, you also have liability. To know something and do nothing is problematic. You've always got to have some kind of response. And it makes sense, in my opinion, that that response be systematized, right? So that every school in your district is not responding differently, right? And every district in your state is not responding differently. You want people to be thinking about these issues and responding to them in a similar fashion. So let's talk a little bit about how problematic sexual behavior presents in schools. What are some of the things you're likely to encounter? Well, unusual bathroom behavior, right? And sometimes what that can mean is you've got a kid who's standing too close to the other kids in the urinal, watching them urinate. Sometimes it can be the little girl who's crawling underneath the toilet stalls in order to watch what her peers are doing under there. So unusual bathroom behavior, we see it a ton in elementary school. And it's usually a good indicator that now is a time to be interested, right? Sometimes defecating, smearing feces, things of that order can also kind of fall into that category. So whenever there's unusual bathroom behavior, it is to your interest to continue to investigate and try to get to the bottom of it, because it could underlie something more serious. If you've got a kid who's demonstrating persistent curiosity about sex, seems to want to talk about it all the time, and that is kind of their primary focus, that's an indicator you might want to be more curious. When children are engaging in frauderism, and that's that new fancy French word you guys just learned. So if kids are, rubbing their genitals against desk chairs or against the floor or against teachers or other kids, that's an indicator that you want to be curious. It doesn't necessarily mean that a kid has been a victim of sexual abuse, right? But it indicates that there's something problematic going on, and it would behoove you to gather more information. A student who's touching other students sexually without their permission or consent at school, obviously that is problematic. Kids who engage in mature sexual talk or making sexual sounds, or again, just seem to be sexually preoccupied. Kids who are engaging in grooming behavior. Grooming behavior, a lot has been said about this. I tend to think of it as just grooming behavior is a lot like dating behavior, right? When we're talking about grooming, we're talking about the same kinds of behaviors that people typically engage in when they're starting to date one another, right? So they use sweet nicknames for each other. They try to touch that person. They might give gifts and things of that order. Grooming behavior in and of itself is not necessarily anything horrible. The issue is when it's being used in a manipulative fashion to try to coerce people into sexual behavior, right? That's really the issue. So when you're seeing kids who are being overly flirtatious or otherwise trying to get compliance with the different kinds of sexual behaviors they're into through grooming, that's something you need to attend to. Obviously, sexually aggressive behavior. So when you've got threats of that or indicators of that, that's important to respond to that. And just to kind of attenuate everyone, it's funny. I remember when I was a school psychologist, I would always walk the halls. I just sort of had a thing trying to, look for kids who needed help or might be struggling. And it was really common sight for me to see girls that were kind of pinned up against a locker by another boy, right? Boy has hands on either side of the girl. Girl's kind of pushed against the locker. Kind of looks romantic, kind of looks threatening, kind of unclear what's happening, right? But I would always step in the middle and be like, hey, let's give her a little space, things of that order. I'm sure I upset a lot of teenage romance back in my days as a school psych. But when you see those kinds of things, it's problematic, right? You want to get in the way of that behavior. You want to communicate to the boy that this is not an appropriate way to respond and act around girls. You want to communicate to the girl, this is not an appropriate way to respond or interact with your peers. So looking for those opportunities to intervene and try to help people figure out how to better navigate their romantic relationships in a functional way, that's certainly part of our responsibility. Obviously, sexual threats is something schools need to respond to. Public masturbation, if that's occurring in class or in the restrooms or things of that order, that's something that would require a response. Students who are exposing themselves sexually to others. And then finally, this last one, in my opinion, is the most important one. Any problematic behavior that continues in spite of intervention is a problematic behavior that needs to be addressed, right? So you think about, I think about myself when I was a kid. Probably the thing I wanted to talk to adults about the least was sexual behavior, certainly my own, right? So anytime that an adult is going and having a conversation with a kid is going to be producing some anxiety in that kid if they're talking about their sexual behavior. So any kid that continues that sexual behavior after an intervention, that clearly was not an effective strategy, right? And it's a strategy that works with most kids. So if it's not working, and if that intervention you've attempted is not working, that lets you know that you probably need to be doing more in terms of figuring out what's going on with that child's behavior. So why context and development are important when thinking about problematic sexual behavior. So on your screen, you see a list of different kinds of problematic sexual behaviors that might come up at a school. We're going to talk about how our perception about those really varies as a function of the age of the kids and the context. And it's important to always keep this in mind. So let's say that we're talking about our kindergartner here engaging in these kinds of behaviors, all right? Exposing genitals, public masturbation, frauderism. I mean, how concerned are we going to be about our kindergartner doing these things? We don't want them to be doing it, right? But I'm not necessarily going to become completely unhinged if I've got a kindergartner engaging in these behaviors, because these are more typical kinds of behaviors that you might see a kindergartner or a first grader engaging in, right? But if he's engaging in sexual touching of peers, or certainly penetrative sexual contact, right? Now I'm going to be freaking out, right? Because those are things that are developmentally inappropriate and very unusual for a kid this age. Now let's change the focus. Let's talk about this fella who's 17 years old, right? And it's kind of interesting here because in some ways things kind of get flipped. If this kid is engaging in penetrative sexual contact with peers who are willing and interested, right? I'm not going to encourage that, but I don't necessarily have a problem with it. That's developmentally appropriate, right? Sexually touching of peers who are interested and willing and wanting of the same behavior, again, not necessarily a concern. Frauderism, that's a little weird for a 17-year-old boy to be engaging in. Public masturbation, oh no, now I'm freaking out, right? Exposing of genitals, these are behaviors that I would not expect a 17-year-old boy to be engaging in. And so those are the things that are going to have a lot more strength about, oh my goodness, this is serious problematic sexual behavior, right? You've got to think about the context. Another thing that's important to think about is development. So these boys are both 16, but are they peers? And if they were to start a sexual relationship, would we consider that to be a sexual relationship that was equivalent and safe and all of these other kinds of things? Probably is going to require more investigation, right? Legally, at least in Oregon, where I'm from, we're having a lovely snow day today, quite surprisingly. There's no law against these two boys engaging in sexual behavior with one another because they're the same age, right? And if they both are agreeing to this behavior, there's no law that says you can't do this, right? However, I think we as educators and people who are involved in the field understand that there's probably something problematic about this relationship that requires a higher level of investigation, right? And so there are going to be situations in which, as a school district, we can't rely upon the law to be able to intervene. We've got to come up with interventions that are intelligent and reasonable that are going to solve these problems because the law can't always provide a solution. Okay, so let's talk about the current state of the art for addressing problematic sexual behavior in most places. This is certainly true in Oregon. This is how things happen. Some significant problematic sexual behavior occurs. Kid is feeling very sad about it. Law enforcement and DHS swoop in. Child is evaluated by a mental health professional, and then planning and disposition. That's usually how things operate, right? There's a lot of problems with the current state of the art with regard to addressing and helping out kids who are struggling with their problematic sexual behavior. One of the problems is just the reliance upon law enforcement to solve this problem. Lots of problematic sexual behavior is not illegal, right? We just talked about one situation, these two 16-year-old boys who have this huge developmental difference. But also too, in most cases, juvenile justice and law enforcement are not going to respond if a kid is under the age of 14, at least in Oregon, right? So all that problematic sexual behavior that we're encountering in your younger kids, which we know from schools, from the data I showed you earlier, that like that's where the biggest problem is, elementary and middle school. Law enforcement can't do anything anyway. So we can't really rely upon them to marshal a response. System doesn't help those young kids. One of the other issues with relying upon law enforcement is their response is unpredictable. And working in Oregon, especially in forensics and different counties, it's shocking to me how some kids will be prosecuted within an inch of their life for the most minor violations, where in other counties, these things are like almost like patently ignored. So this idea that like law enforcement is going to be able to have the judgment to figure out how to respond to these things is really unwise. And as schools and as communities, we need to really have a more thoughtful and intelligent response than just throwing law enforcement at it. It's not law enforcement's fault. They've got limited tools for addressing these concerns, right? Their job is not to change problematic behavior. It's to try to stop it and make sure that we're creating a situation of safety for everybody, right? But, we know this is starting to lead to some of that school to prison pipeline, the over-involvement and over-dependence we've had on law enforcement. So it's important. Law enforcement is certainly an important part of the equation, but we need to recognize that it's not entirely their responsibility. And there's a lot of things they can't do that we need to be able to do for kids. It's also problematic, in my opinion, to wait until the problematic sexual behavior is so serious that we've got to rely upon law enforcement, right? When we do that, we're ignoring all these antecedents that if we are well-trained, we can identify these things really early on. We can get to them in the prodromal phase before people are getting hurt. It's a system that's reactive rather than proactive. I don't like that. I don't think any of you do, right? We want to try to find these kids when this problematic behavior is just kind of starting to blossom, right? So that we can get them the help that they need. And we're also kind of operating in a situation where we're to the right of the bang, right? The serious harm has already occurred. We want to get to the left of the bang. We want to be in a situation where we're able to anticipate that situation and prevent it rather than allowing it to blow up in our faces. Another problem with the way we do things now is psychosexual assessment. And I say this realizing that about 50% of the work I do is psychosexual assessment. I would love to not have to do these anymore. There's a real problem with relying upon psychosexual assessment. One, it's pathology-based. And one of the things we know about kids with problematic sexual behavior is that most of these kids don't have mental health issues or behavioral issues, right? So we're kind of using a shotgun on a mosquito in these sorts of situations. We don't necessarily need that level of examination for most kids with problematic sexual behavior. Another problem is it's really slow. So think about if you're a school district and you've identified problematic sexual behavior on a Monday, okay? You need to be able to have a plan in place for that kid when he comes back to school on Tuesday. If psychosexual assessment is part of your plan, that's going to put your plan off by about 2 to 3 months, right? I can tell you right now, I am booking mid-July for the evaluations that I do. And usually after I conduct an evaluation, it takes me about 3 weeks to write a report. I'm pretty fast. I know other folks, it takes them 2 months to write a report. So think about having to wait all that time just to figure out how to help a kid, right? And get a kid back into school. It's nuts. It's also very evaluator dependent. Any of you who look at psychosexual evaluations regularly realize that like what it is varies as a function of the person you get it from. In Oregon, we don't have a lot of rules about who can conduct psychosexual assessments. So some of them are done by psychologists, some of them are done by master's level clinicians, some of them are done by folks with BAs. So you never really know the quality of the product that you're going to be getting. They're also really expensive, right? Typical psychosexual in Oregon is going to cost about $3,600 to do. That's a very pricey evaluation. The quality and the content, like I mentioned before, varies. When you get a psychosexual evaluation, we know that it's very time limited. Most evaluations will come back with a risk prediction they'll say is good for like 6 months. That's not helpful. That's not responsive to change. That doesn't tell you how that kid's risk is going to change after you implement all these great interventions. So it's not always necessarily very helpful. That expertise is costly, it's limited, it's hard to access. And like I mentioned before, it's wickedly slow. We need something that is going to be able to get that kid back in school the following day. Psychosexual assessment isn't it. So why planning and disposition are not enough? Doesn't consider the passage of time, doesn't respond to contextual changes, often not comprehensive. It's not clear who's in charge of making sure what plans are followed. It's unclear who's liable when the plans fail, right? So you've got to have some kind of a mechanism in place that is going to be responsive to changes in the individual. It's going to consider that kid comprehensively, not just how they behave at school, but what's going on for them in the community. And it's going to have a system at the end that tells you who is responsible for what interventions for this kid so that we can make sure that there's good accountability for everyone involved, right? If we create a great plan for a kid, but ultimately no one has responsibility for it, that plan doesn't get followed through with. And then all of a sudden you've just kind of wasted your time and created a situation that it really is going to benefit this kid in any way. So what we need is something that can really be centralized and equitable, an unbiased mechanism for quickly identifying kids with varying degrees of problematic sexual behavior, something that's immediately responsive, safety focused, easy to implement, and clearly distributes liability. You're probably thinking like, what? How can such a thing exist? Well, it does, guys. And I'm going to talk to you about how that looks. So what we found down in Salem when we were creating this model is that a leveled approach is a really elegant mechanism for identifying kids with problematic sexual behavior and helping them get the supervision and support that they need immediately, while also recognizing that you're going to need additional consultation in some cases. So public education, they're really well designed to capture problematic sexual behavior, provided all the staff are educated about what to look for and who to send that information to, right? Kind of the fancy term for that is funneling leakage. So it's important in your system for this to work that everybody have training about what to look for and who to send it to. And when I say everybody, I mean everybody, right? So your teachers, your administrators, the janitor, right, who's cleaning the lockers and suddenly discovers, oh, there's a porn mag in one of my lockers, right? The bus driver who is driving home and realizes we've got 2 kids in the back who are having some kind of sexual contact, right? Everybody's got to know what to look for. And then they got to know who to talk to about it. So you've got to have a clearly identified individual who is the receiver of all that leakage. You've got to have a systematic and unbiased method for immediate initial evaluation. So when we get that information, how do we make a decision about what are we going to do? Are we going to immediately respond? Are we going to seek additional consultation? So you've got to have, that's got to be a part of the puzzle. You got to have a mechanism for accessing expertise when it's needed, because we recognize that in some of these cases, right, about 70 to 80 of the 200 to 250 cases that I talked to you guys about earlier, you're going to need another level, someone else you can talk to, an expert in the community. So how do we know when we need it? And then you've got to have a means of tracking that concern until the threat is successfully mitigated. So a mechanism to determine whose responsibility is what, and how often are we going to check in to make sure everybody's doing what they said they were going to do. Okay, so this is a little model that talks about how this system works. So the school learns of a threat. Okay, the SRO, if you've got a school resource officer, if you don't, that's fine. You're going to use the administrator and the school counselor. They determine whether or not there's a need for a level 1. So you've got Jimmy peeing in the bark dust, right? They're going to have a conversation. They just found out about it. What do we do? Do we think this needs a level 1? Now, probably the first time that occurs, they're going to say to themselves, it probably does not need a level 1, right? There's probably not an issue here. Let's try some things with Billy and see if we can get him to stop peeing in the bark dust on his own. And so they're going to document Billy peeing in the bark dust. Here's what we decided we were going to do. We're going to talk to mom and dad, have a conversation with them about what's going on with Billy and see if maybe he needs some medical help, or talk to them about, is he peeing in the backyard at home, that kind of thing. And then we're going to communicate back to the teacher, hey, we're going to talk to the parents, we'll get more information to you, and we're going to do an administrative action if we need to. Now, let's say that problem continues. Billy's continuing to pee in the bark dust, like in our example we saw earlier, and it's starting to get more serious. He's engaging in frauderism. He touched a girl's butt during circle time, right? These are all things that are telling us it's more serious. So they might decide when that information comes, yes, in fact, we do need to look at this more closely. And so what they do is they initiate a level 1 meeting. That's going to occur the very same day that they learn of the threat. So if they learn about that on a Monday, they're going to have that meeting Monday afternoon to have that determination about how serious this concern is. During that level 1 team meeting, they're going to go over the level 1 protocol. You all should have received a copy of this. It's a PDF document that I sent out. And it talks exactly about the kinds of questions and concerns that people are going to go over in that meeting. I'm not going to go into that in great detail today, but you've got it in front of you. Feel free to reference it as we're talking today. You can always consult with me. Just call me up. I'm happy to talk to you about it and give you information if you have more information about it. But that's what they're doing in that level 1 team meeting. They're going over that protocol. And in that protocol, we'll talk about it in a little bit. They're going to have a number of different questions that they consider. At the end of that protocol, they may decide there's no concern. Hey, everything looks good. We don't have any concern, right? So then they go back to the document, discipline, communicate, and administrate. Or they may decide additional consultation is needed, right? It may be that the level 1 that they have, they're able to solve all the problems right there. And if they do, that's great. If not, they may seek additional consultation. If they do, they're going to take that to a level 2 team. That level 2 team is a multi-agency level 2 team. They meet on a weekly basis, and their job is to provide consultation to the school district about their more serious behavioral concerns. Now, the example I gave you, the kid peeing in the bark dust, that's probably never going to make it to a level 2, right? But the other examples I gave you, the example, say, of the 2 boys who were caught in the locker room, that might go to a level 2, right? Because that's particularly more complex, and you need to have a little bit more of an elegant solution. So you might want to talk to the community leaders in order to find a good solution. That level 2 team is made up of experts in the field. You've got DHS at the table. You've got someone from the juvenile prosecutor's office. You've got law enforcement is there. You've got mental health at the table. So you've got all the folks in the community who might be knowledgeable about the other issues that could be relevant in this case. They're going to have a conversation. They're going to provide information back to that level 1 team of recommendations about what they should do that level 1 team can then implement. That level 2 team is also going to handle any move-ins. So whenever you've got a kid who comes into district who has pre-identified problematic sexual behavior, they're going to go directly to that level 2 team. That level 2 team is going to be part of the introduction process. They're going to feed it back to the school and say, hey, here's a list of recommendations we have for you to help with this kid who we know is struggling with problematic sexual behavior. Most districts who implement this process also have a level 2 facilitator, and it's that person's job to make sure that nothing gets dropped in this process, right? They run that level 2 team, and they also help to facilitate the communication between the level 1 team and the level 2 team. And they might also sometimes help out the level 1 team if the level 1 team is feeling like they're in a little bit over their head on a problem. Okay, so that's how the system works, essentially. School learns of a threat. So what are some of the threats? Some potentially harmful touching. Maybe there's a violent threat. Maybe it's a sexual threat, a normative or non-normative one. Again, if you have knowledge, you have liability. But once that school learns about that information, then they have to make a decision about how they're going to respond. And it doesn't matter if that occurs inside or outside of school. Remember, we don't want a kid who's working on a bomb to bring it to school. We don't want a kid who's working on a sex bomb to bring it to school. We want those things to stay where they are. So you have a mechanism for capturing leakage. In this system, what we encourage is that all that information gets fed to the school counselor and the administrator. So part of about a 10-minute training that every district gives folks at the beginning of the year who use this model, they'll talk briefly about here are the kinds of behaviors that we're looking for. And if you see those behaviors, here's who you take it to. So everybody in your district, from the administrator all the way to the teachers and the bus drivers and the janitors, they all understand that if they see anything concerning, it needs to go to the school counselor and the administrator. And those people are going to be the ones who deal with it. That way, you're not losing any of that leakage that would help you identify problematic sexual behavior early on. So as I mentioned, if there's a concern and schools want to go to a level 1, they're going to make a determination about whether or not they need to do that. Sometimes that might involve having law enforcement or an SRO, certainly with things that there's some kind of legal violation, right? If it's at a high school or middle school and you know that law enforcement might have a response, in some cases it's worthwhile to involve them. Their job might be to interview students and witnesses. They're going to gather material evidence and determine if a criminal offense was committed. But as a school district, you shouldn't care one way or the other whether a criminal offense was committed, because you still have a responsibility to make sure that your school is safe and that the kids are getting their needs met. So regardless of how the SROs and law enforcement respond, schools still need to have a response. So law enforcement might conduct an arrest, or they might refer to a level 1 team as well in that process. The counselor and the administrator are going to gather school information. So they're going to make a determination about, is this kid part of special education services? What's their academic history look like? What's their discipline history look like? And they're going to bring that information to the level 1. They're also going to look, they might also confer with the SRO, and they're going to consider any of the safety or liability concerns that might be relevant in that situation. At that level 1 team, these are the folks who are going to be there. You want to invite the parents to participate in the level 1 because they're going to have a lot of really useful information. And a lot of the job in that level 1 is to help the parents understand that we are here to support your student. We're not here to tell you that there's something wrong with your student or anything like that. We're here to protect them and protect their reputation, right? And we want to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen at school again. So that's the purpose of the meeting. In that meeting, this group is going to go over all the information in that level 1 protocol. And it may be too that you find that there are other relevant parties you want to include that you wouldn't typically include, like maybe DHS if these are foster kids, maybe the therapist if this is a kid who's already in treatment, maybe probation if this is a kid who's already involved with juvenile justice system. That level 1 protocol, there's a safety and security part of it. You're going to gather demographic data on that individual. You're going to go through the screening, and the screening is a list of about 12 different questions that you go through. Actually, I think it's closer to 18 different questions that you go through in order to make a determination about the seriousness of that. At the end of that, there's a supervision plan that you develop with the team. And if you decide you need additional consultation, you would activate a level 2. And so what you would do is set up that supervision plan to act while you're waiting to have that level 2 meeting. But in most cases, as I showed you guys earlier, the majority of cases are going to be solved without necessarily having to go to a level 2. That level 2 is there in case you need additional info. And then you sign it, you send out that information to the parties it's relevant to. So anyone who has a responsibility for following that plan needs to have a copy of it. And then you file that information in the student's record. In that screening section, this is essentially the kinds of information we're looking at. We're trying to determine whether or not that incident that occurred was peer-to-peer. So are these kids the same age? Is there a concern or an imbalance with regard to gender, or with regard to cognitive ability, or with regard to developmental ability, or with regard to social status? So we're trying to make a determination about, was one child coerced in some way, maybe in ways that were subtle, right? Sometimes social status is a mechanism for coercion more than anything. So it's important to think about all those different levels. Who are the 2 people that are involved in this interaction, and what elements might suggest that it was problematic? And then we look at the incident details. So was the incident itself coercive? Is this an isolated event or a pattern? Was it impulsive versus planful? Was it normative versus non-normative? And by normative versus non-normative, I mean developmentally normative or non-normative, right? So Is this behavior that we would expect to see for a kid this age, or is it behavior that's not expected to be seen among kids this age? And part of this documentation, there's a whole list of behaviors that we consider to be normative or non-normative based on development. So teachers and administrators, as they're going through this, can make a decision about, well, this does seem like this is unusual behavior for a kid this age, kind of a thing. Is there confusion about the details? So do the parties who were involved in this seem to have different versions of the events? That oftentimes can be an indicator that something problematic has occurred. Is there a clear power imbalance, whether with regard to physical size or social or cognitive capacity? We had a case a while back ago when I was working in Forest Grove, where we had an adolescent male who was clearly targeting girls who were developmentally disabled. He was dating the girls who were kind of in the intellectually disabled classrooms, and was clearly targeting these kids and focusing on them. They were all his same age, so the law had no way it could respond to it, but there was a clear power imbalance, right? And so this is one of those lovely situations in which the school could marshal a response that was meaningful and impactful, even though law enforcement had nothing they could do. Obviously, it was their use of a weapon. That's going to indicate there was some kind of problematic coercive situation. Is there discomfort? Did either of the parties talk about there being discomfort in the situation? And then did grooming occur? And so those, if you look at those different questions in that protocol, they essentially are designed to look at those elements. If there's no concern, you just dismiss it, right? You document, you discipline, you communicate, and you do the administrative stuff you would normally do. And there's no concern, you move on. If there is a concern, then you move on to supervision. This is probably a model that a lot of you have seen about when you think about supervision, right? Intent, opportunity, and access. This is a common Venn diagram that's used when we're thinking about supervision. These are the different areas that you can impact, right? You could potentially impact intent, you could impact opportunity, and you can impact access. If you were to think about it, like kind of an easy example, think about it in terms of potential school shooter. So one thing you could do is you could impact that person's access to guns, right? So you make sure mom and dad have everything locked up, or they move the guns out of the house, right? And that will help to eliminate part of the problem. You could eliminate opportunity. So you're going to make sure that that kid is searched when they're coming to school, and you're making sure that they've got good supervision while they're in school and outside of school, so that we're limiting their opportunity to engage in that behavior. And then the other one would be intent, right? You want to do things to try to provide treatment and support for that child so that they're no longer feeling the desire to go and shoot others. So that'd be an easy way to think about it. Problem is, it kind of falls apart when you're thinking about sexual behavior, right? Because access to what, right? Access to their penis, what, to pornography, to their brain? Like, what do we remove? Like there's nothing you can do to limit the access oftentimes. So it's really about opportunity and intent. How do we limit opportunity? How do we impact intent? Good news for schools. Intent is not your gig, right? That is the job of folks in the community who provide therapy. It's their job to provide treatment that impacts intent. Schools can't be expected to do that, but schools can impact opportunity, and so can the community. We can really do a lot of things to impact opportunity in a meaningful way. If you're looking at that protocol, you'll see that the second section of that protocol is all about supervision strategies. And there's literally a checklist of boxes you can check that will allow you to provide different kind of strategies that you could put in place for a kid with problematic sexual behavior. You'll notice they're numbered. If you go back and look at the protocol questions, you'll notice that at the bottom of each question, it provides you a series of numbers, and those numbers are associated with the supervision strategies that might help to prevent that behavior. So if you identify this is a kid with really problematic coercive behavior that involves weapons, and you go to the numbers that are associated with that in the supervision strategy, there's a direct relationship. So those supervision strategies should directly address that issue. So when it comes to supervision planning and managing liability, an important thing to think about is protecting the potential target, right? So obviously there's duty to warn. If we've got a situation where an individual has identified a potential target for sexual harm, you want to do everything you can to alert that individual. In this protocol, we have developed some paperwork that our lawyers have gone over that it's an appropriate way of providing information to that potential target so that they can protect their student, right? And what it would look like, let's take the example I gave you of the 16-year-old who had a rape diary, essentially, where he'd been plotting the rape of one of his classmates. With this strategy, you're able to go ahead, contact the parents of the identified target and say, hey, we've got a concern. I can't give you a tremendous amount of detail about it, but I can provide you enough detail to let you know you need to keep your student safe. She's not to have any contact with this other person who's been making threats against her. We're going to do everything we can on a school-based basis to make sure that the supervision is adequate, but know in the community as well that this person should not be around your daughter or your son. If you're seeing this person around your daughter or your son, alert the authorities immediately so that we're making sure that nothing bad happens. So protecting the target is certainly a part of it. Individual options, if you'll notice in those supervision strategies on that document, a lot of it is about personal accountability. So one of the things that I like to know about kids with problematic sexual behavior, one of the things I want to know is this a problem you want to solve? Is this an issue that you think is a concern, right? So we want to have a lot of opportunities for kids to demonstrate that they have a concern and that they are going to be working to try to provide accountability. It's useful information to me when we do that and then they don't follow through with that plan, right? That tells me something too that's really useful, that this is a kid who can't be trusted to operate independently. They really are going to need some external supervision in order not to harm others. So accountability plan is an important part of that. Then there's a lot of different kinds of school options you'll notice listed in there. Things that have to do with like the level of supervision a kid might need during class or between classes, the areas where that supervision is going to be most important and impactful, who are going to be the knowledgeable supervisors for those kids, and what are the special considerations. And in the districts where I helped implement this program, one of the things we talk to the knowledgeable supervisors about is we tell them if a kid is having problematic sexual behavior, that child is having boundary issues, is how we frame it. The boundary issue could mean that when you stand too close to them, they're going to poke you in the eye, or it could mean when you stand too close to them, they're going to grab your butt, right? And honestly, it doesn't matter because all the staff need to know is that it's a personal boundary issue problem, right? That should give them all the information that they need to know to provide adequate supervision without revealing too much to the staff about what that particular kid's issues are, right? We want to protect the reputation of the kids with problematic sexual behavior. And so one of the ways we can do that is by creating a language that staff can easily use that isn't going to identify that kid in a negative way. There's lots of family options in that plan too, right? So there's mechanism for holding the family accountable. So there's things about parental responsibility. If this is your kid and they're struggling with problematic sexual behavior, you got to let other people know if they're supervising your kid, right? You can't send it to camp and not let the folks there know. You can't have a babysitter over to the house and not let the babysitter know. You sure as heck can't have a sleepover or send your kid over to someone else's house without letting those folks know. Just like if you have a dog that bites, right? You can't just let that dog run around. You've got to let folks know my dog bites. So there's a mechanism in there to help families provide accountability and make sure that they're doing what they can in the community. There's also lots of community options in that supervision plan that have to do with making sure that kid has access to mental health, or maybe faith-based solutions that could potentially be helpful or beneficial to that kid, and other community organizations that might be able to provide additional support. So one of the, I think, really elegant things about this process is, although it's really designed for schools, the solution is really global in the sense that it's meant to impact the behavior and the supervision strategies for that kid across all their different kinds of environments. And also, I think, to provide a level of accountability to the parents. Oftentimes, as I'm sure you guys have encountered, we've got situations in which parents might be aware of the problematic sexual behavior, but they don't want to do anything. And they don't want to tell anybody about it because they feel embarrassed. And that's, although that's understandable, that's the kind of thing that can really lead to the explosion of a sexual behavior issue, because then you've got a kid out there who's harming all these other kids, right? So this provides a real solid mechanism to make sure that parents are also seeing themselves as a part of the solution. So that all that I just talked about, that's all level 1 stuff, right? That's all stuff that can be done in a level 1. So those are all solutions that a level 1 team can put together. But sometimes they put together all the solutions and maybe it doesn't work. And so they realize we need more solutions. Or it might be a situation where they put together all these solutions, but they're still just kind of freaked out, right? We've got a kid that we don't know what to do with, and we're feeling a lot of anxiety. Teachers are panicking, parents are panicking. What do we do? So you take that kid to a level 2. You'll go to a level 2 if that situation's intense, if the threat is targeted, if that incident is non-normative. And again, when I'm saying non-normative, I mean developmentally non-normative. If you have concerns, even after setting up supervision for that kid, that it's not going to be adequate, or if there's any kind of need for an additional support, that's when you take it to a level 2. And that level 2 allows you access to professionals, to the community experts, right? It's kind of like getting all the good stuff out of a psychosexual without wasting 2 months of your life waiting for one to come, right? You can get that information in a week. So that level 2 exists because of memorandums of understanding or memorandums of agreement, depending upon what environment you're operating in, between the school district and the different agencies on that team. So law enforcement, the other community agencies that are there, like DHS, the mental health, other folks in the community that might be interested players in that whole process, and the school. They've got to have an MOU that allows them to have communication, right? So in that context, in that environment, school can talk to law enforcement can talk to mental health. Everybody can have an open communication about how best to plan and solve the situation for this child. Obviously, high level confidentiality. Everybody who is there has to abide by that, and there needs to be a legal agreement that oversees that, and that's kind of what the MOU is about. If you want to learn more about this process, I've got copies of MOUs I can send to you so you can get a sense for like, what am I going to have to do? I will not lie to you. It is a pain in the butt, right? Because you do your thing for the school and you're like, hey, we've got our happy little MOU, and you send it to law enforcement, and then their lawyers pour over it and they're like, well, we want these 5 words changed. And okay, now law enforcement is on board. Now we take it to DHS. Their lawyers look at it. Their lawyers want to change things. So usually it can be a couple of months setting up that level 2 team, because you're kind of getting through that MOU process of making sure everybody's comfortable with the way it's being communicated. But that multi-agency approach is super powerful, right? You've got school district staff there. So you've got your level 2 facilitator, you've got your SPED representative or your student services representative, you've got school administrators there, you've got school counselors there, you've got law enforcement and juvenile justice, community mental health, court authority, Department of Human Services, right? All the major players with regard to problematic sexual behavior are at that meeting. And it's their job to have a conversation about how best to provide support for that kid that they then feed back to that level 1 team. So in that level 2, it's all about consultation, right? Supervision and intervention. What are we going to do for this kid? What creative solutions can we employ? Maybe it's going to involve referrals to mental health or DHS or juvenile justice, right? So that we can provide adequate support for this kid. Sometimes it's going to be about pulling on community resources, right? So who are our community partners that we could count upon to help us get this kid involved in some things that are going to be meaningful for them, right? So like, hey, maybe this kid would really benefit from like getting involved in a Taekwondo class where they're really going to have an opportunity to focus with someone who is going to be providing them a really strong idea of like what is morally okay. Taekwondo classes are a great environment for that. Well, maybe we can secure some funding to get this kid into a class like that. That's going to help them develop some self-esteem in a proactive way where they're going to get a lot of really good supervision around their peers. So really becomes this mechanism for the people who know the most to have a communication about what they could possibly do to help that kid. That level 2 team is also going to track that case until it resolves. Once it comes to the level 2 team, after they come up with their solutions, they feed those solutions back to level 1, and they're going to say, we're going to check back in however long they think it might be necessary. So sometimes it might be next week if it's a particularly hot case. Sometimes it might be like, we're going to wait a month and check in. And then maybe after things seem to be running smoothly, it might be like, well, we're going to check in 6 months. And then it might be like, hey, we're just going to check in on a yearly basis, right? But the idea is that case continues to get revisited until the school says, we no longer have a concern and we no longer need additional support from you. So the ball doesn't get dropped, manages that liability in a successful way. So how does it solve the problem? Well, one of the cool things about this is even subclinical problems are identified and considered in catalog, right? So if you've got Billy who's peeing in the bark dust, at the very least, you're going to have a record of that, okay? So when it shows up again and again and again that this problem is not resolved, and now he's in 3rd grade and he's still peeing in the bark dust, right? At the very least, you have a mechanism to record what's gone on for this kid and the different interventions and strategies that have been applied. Lovely thing about it, supervision's immediately responsive and flexible. So you have that meeting on Monday. When that kid comes to school on Tuesday, you've got a supervision plan in place that mom and dad are down with, that the school is down with, that the community is down with. You've got a plan. You don't need to wait weeks and weeks and weeks to get that kid back into school. If you need a higher level of expertise, you can access it when it's needed. You don't have to go and pay some psychologist a ridiculous amount of money and wait several months to get feedback on your kid. You go to the experts, you can go every week and ask them the questions you have, and they can provide you additional strategies. The liability is transparently assigned. So when you get done with that level 1 or level 2 meeting, it's going to be clear who has to do what, right? So it might be the teacher's job to provide supervision strategies in these certain places, and it's the administrator's job to check in with that teacher on a regular basis to make sure that those methods are effective for that kid, right? So everybody knows what their job is. And also too, if people aren't doing their job, you've got a mechanism for accountability. You can go back and be like, hey, you didn't do your job. It says right here, you were going to do that thing. You didn't do it, right? So, which I think is nice too, because I think a lot of times it's easy to feel like, oh, kids with problematic sexual behavior, they're the problem. Sometimes it's us, man. Sometimes we can't marshal our resources effectively enough to really be able to address these needs. And we just keep blaming the kid when really it's a fault of our own. So this allows you to kind of get by that. And you continue to track that case until that threat is successfully mitigated. So once it's no longer a concern, you don't have to keep tracking it, but you are going to continue to attend to it until it's resolved. Other benefits of this approach. So it creates a common language across multiple disciplines. So when this strategy is being used well, you create a situation in which juvenile justice learns to speak school, school learns to speak cop, cop learns to speak mental health, right? Everybody gets to benefit from each other's knowledge, and they come together and learn from one another. So it allows for a lot of interagency collaboration. And we found too, not just around problematic sexual behavior, but around other things as well, because then you start to realize like, hey, if I have a cop question, I know a cop, right? Because I talk to this guy on a regular basis. I can call him up. Or, hey, if I have a school counseling question, if I'm a cop and I've got a school counseling question, I know how to call a school counselor because I see this person regularly, right? So helps cops think more like teachers, helps teachers think more like cops in ways that are potentially beneficial. So it becomes a mechanism for communication that can really benefit all the folks who are involved in that system. Here is the book that I wrote about this approach. It's in its second edition right now. It contains in it, when I wrote the book, I wrote it thinking of the least intelligent school administrator I knew at the time. And I thought to myself, I want a book that this guy could pick up and read and be able to implement, right? And so it is incredibly friendly. And I think in a lot of ways, kind of fun and interesting. It's meant to be written in a really easy to read kind of fashion. But it's also got lots of meaty chapters in there too about like the research that we know about kids with problematic sexual behavior. It's got a whole thing in there on Title IX and how this interfaces with Title IX. It's got a chapter on that. And it's also got all of the different forms that go along with this process are included in there. Now, I will let you know, my wife and I are working on a third edition of this. And in that, what we're doing is we are kind of revamping all of those protocols to I want them to be a little bit more attenuated to issues of equity than they are right now. They're about 10 years old, and like where we were thinking then is different than where we are now. So in the third edition, it's going to be even tighter, but that probably won't be out for another year or two. If you want to get a hold of me, I love to talk about these kinds of things. I love to consult pro bono for free. Just call me up. I'm happy to talk to you about this. Email me, text me. You know, I love this stuff. So I'm happy to talk to you about any case, no charge, you know, anytime you want to call, let me know. I'm here to answer your questions and help you figure out how to navigate this stuff. Okay, so I should have plenty of time for questions left. So for those of you who have questions about this process or about how this works or the protocol itself, let me know and we can talk about it.
And thank you, Dr. Kenney. The other thing that we can do too, if you want to go through the PDF, you know, we can share that with them, the PDF about the sexual incident response system. I don't know if we want to just roll through that real quick since we have a little bit extra time.
Yeah, let me do that. Let me see if I can figure out how to pull that up.
I have it. If you want me to share my screen, I can do that.
I think I got it here. Let me I'm going to stop sharing real quick, find it, and then I will share it.
Sounds good.
Because I think I pulled it up right before this.
And in the interim, if folks have questions for Dr. Kenney, feel free to take yourself off mute and jump in with your question, or if you want to use the raise your hand function, or if you just want to type it in the chat, whichever way you feel most comfortable. And I see Sonia, you have a question off the top, so go right ahead. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you, Dr. Kenney, for your presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I had a question, and this is sort of general, but in hearing what you shared about kind of what deems a behavior to be problematic,
Yeah.
and sort of going more, I appreciated the part around sometimes in cases where there are no penal code types of crimes committed, those are more sort of clear cut around the response from the school potentially, right? And so
Yeah.
are there any sort of best practices, and I haven't been able to dive deep into the PDF you shared, thank you for that, but
Sure.
just sort of suggestions around navigating that piece for the administrators or school staff around when it's sort of a subjective sort of situation that really each side is maybe different, and sort of how to best approach any sort of intervention or resolution that doesn't necessarily place blame on one party or another. That sort of seems to be a really, for me, a challenging piece to kind of work through around, like, okay, typically if there's a rule broken, then that's when we can go
Right.
back to say, like, this is why we're moving forward with this sort of intervention. And in this case, it's sort of much more gray. So I don't know if you can
Yeah.
speak to that a bit.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. I think a lot of it is that, we get this mentality of like, there's a perpetrator and a victim, right? And certainly for those of you who've been in the field for a while, I know when I first got into the field, that's all we thought about, right? Perpetrator and victim. Somebody is a bad, naughty sexual abuser, and the other person is a victim in the situation. And I think over the course of time, if you work in this field, you start to realize that like, it's so much more gray in a lot of cases about what occurred, who did what to whom, things of that order. And I think one of the things I've learned repeatedly is that like assigning blame is not necessarily going to be particularly helpful in any kind of situation. So a lot of it has been through education, right? In the districts that I've worked in, I've also been brought in to do a lot of education around problematic sexual behavior to try to help them understand that these kids that they think of oftentimes like the worst nightmare, right? When you think about problematic sexual behavior in kids, everyone's like, oh, pedophile, oh, rapist. No, that's not who these kids are, right? These kids are mostly kids who are just struggling with some kind of problematic behavior. And so what a lot of my job has been about is helping people to understand that sexual behavior is just another mechanism of problematic behavior, right? All this stuff, all this moral loading that we have on it is really getting in the way of being able to provide really good solutions for kids that are going to benefit everybody. So I really try to encourage people to not to try to have a little distance between all the moralizing and all the moral loading that they necessarily have around these issues, and to try to think about how do we be curious about what's occurring, and how do we be creative about finding solutions for kids, right? And really, that to me is our job more than anything. So I really try to encourage people, be curious, be creative, be enthusiastic, and try to not be judgmental. Like that's not going to help anyone in this situation. And it's interesting too, because that whole like, that judgmentalism really can lead us to do really stupid things with regard to intervention, right? If I make the mistake of thinking that I know who the perpetrator is, right? The perpetrator, like that can lead me to make some really bad interventions for the kids who were involved in this incident, right? Because I may be missing important contextual information. And so one of the nice things about a system like this is that, everyone who's involved in an incident can be included in that level one process, because the level one process is not about passing judgment. It's about trying to find useful supervision strategies, right? We want to make sure it didn't occur again. And I tell parents when I go in, I don't know if your kid did this or not. And I don't care. I just want to make sure that it doesn't happen again. I want to make sure that this allegation doesn't occur again, right? I'm unconcerned with the facts of the case. What I care about is making sure that we're not in this situation again. And here are some ideas I have about how we can creatively solve this problem, right? I have found that to be a pretty useful approach for talking to people about it, especially for diffusing parents, because you can imagine, right? When you get the call, you're at home, oh, hey, your kid was involved in a sexual incident. We'd like you to come to school. And right, panic is the first thing that a parent is going to feel. So I think when they see that you are a person who is not overly judgmental and upset about this and not worked up, and that your job is just there to provide help and creativity, and that you're not there to point the finger or tell them their kid is bad in some way, it really diffuses a lot of that. But I mean, that is a long that's a long haul, right? Like start that work now when you have opportunities included in small conversations, when you're communicating with other people in your field. If you're given an opportunity to lecture, talk to larger audiences. I mean, it's something we've kind of all got to be selling all the time in order to get people to really experience kids with problematic sexual behavior as having a problem with their behavior first and foremost, right? So those are the kinds of things that I've done that I have found to be particularly effective with that.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I found that document, so I think I can bring that up if you want me to go over that protocol. Yeah, okay. I'm going to try this again. There it is. Okay, can everyone see that?
Great, thanks.
All right, great. So I'm just going to go over this briefly. There's in the book, there's a very detailed description of everything in here and why it looks the way that it looks, right? This first page, we've got the disposition of what occurs on the first page of the document. And part of the reason why it's on the very first page, even though this is like one of the last things you'd complete, is really to kind of decrease the nosy factor, right? Of people going into a file and sniffing around. This is what's going to be part of a kid's confidential file. But we also don't want people to necessarily just go leafing through it. If you want to know what the disposition was, it's there on the very first page. Okay, so that's what that first page is about. This second page talks about the sexual incident. You saw this before in that fancy PowerPoint where you had all the little drop downs and arrows. This is just another iteration of that where it talks about the ways in which you can access help. I would alert you to the fact that that number is not relevant anymore. That's a very old number in there. Down here, this is how we start each level 1 meeting. So we start by reading out this information. And what it does is this describes what the level 1 protocol is and what it isn't. Talks about how this is not a risk assessment, talks about how it's not a psychological assessment, talks about how it's really for disposition and planning. And that's what the purpose of it is. Talks about who should be there for that meeting, right? So administrators and parents and things of that order. If you've got a parent who refuses to be at the meeting, you still have the meeting, okay? Because the meeting is designed to help provide support to the kid and to help the school manage liability. Whether or not a parent decides they're going to attend that, you've got to be able to manage those things, right? So I would never make it dependent upon parental involvement. Sometimes parents will say, well, I'm not coming. We say, hey, that's fine. We're still having the meeting without you. Because we've got to solve this problem, whether or not you want to be a part of the solution. Here, we've got the level 1 screening, make sure everybody is safe, right? So, you know, if there's some immediate emergent need, you'd want to address that before doing this. And then this is where we gather basic demographic information on that kid, okay? Here in the screening, there's a brief description of what occurred. And have we talked to the SRO about this? Have we involved law enforcement? And then we go through each one of the questions, right? So the first question, are the individuals involved in the sexual incident roughly equivalent in regard to development, cognitive capacity, physical capacity, emotional functioning, and coping skills? Yes or no? And then a spot for description. And then it gives you a little note about why this is an important question, right? So in developing this protocol, I really try to create a situation where I was hopeful that I could be like, I'm going to try to lend my knowledge base to a document so that if anyone were reading this document, they would be able to figure out like what to ask and why that question was relevant. And then at the bottom of that first section, you'll see consider supervision strategies, go to page 10 or 11. And then if you look at the numbers 18, 20, 50, and 52, those are all strategies that are designed to speak specifically to that level of concern, okay? So it's designed to kind of help also guide the user to be like, hey, if this is coming up, you probably want to look at these supervision strategies. You don't have to use them, but those are the ones that could potentially be most beneficial. And we gather the second section is about historical data. So is there a known history of previous sexually inappropriate behavior? Has a student involved in the incident been previously censured, disciplined, or placed on a behavior safety plan? Is there any evidence that the student has been exposed to inappropriate sexual content or behavior, right? And again, provides the rationale for each one of those questions, and then also the supervision strategies. And one thing that people commonly ask when they're going through this, do I have to ask every question? No, you don't. You ask the ones that you think are relevant, right? The ones that are going to be most specific to the situation. If you feel like it's completely irrelevant question, you know, don't bother asking it. One question later on, there's a question about like, was there a weapon used? You know, if it's a kid peeing in the bark dust, don't ask a question about was there a weapon present? That's a stupid question, right? So look at the protocol, feel free to use it in a way that is flexible and is going to address whatever the situation is at hand. The third section gets at the incident details. So do all the parties involved in the incident have a similar description of it? Was coercion or violence or threat or manipulation or gifts used in the commission of this? Was the sexual behavior consistent with developmentally normative or common sexual conduct for kids that age? Did the incident cause physical or emotional pain or discomfort? What does the student indicate was the motive, right? How do they explain it? Was there an obvious imbalance of power? Was a weapon present? Did grooming occur in the context of the incident? And there's a whole list of grooming behaviors that goes along with this if the folks want to refer to that. Did staff, parents, or others voice a strong visceral response regarding the incident? And if yes, describe, right? And then it has other concerns as well. So are there issues about enuresis and capricis, harming animals? Are they planful? Are they impulsive? Are they opportunistically vigilant? This is it's a fancy clinical term that I came up with. I don't know if anyone uses this. It just was the fanciest way I come up with it. But the basic idea behind it is you sometimes get kids who watch the watchers, right? If you've got a kid who is watching the watchers, then that is a kid that is going to require higher level of supervision, right? Because they are attending to the fact that they are being observed in order to determine the times when it's going to be most to their benefit to act out, right? So opportunistically vigilant is just referring to a kid who watches the watchers. And then are there other concerns about threatening behavior? Is there suicidal ideation? Is there targeted threat? Is there fire setting? Do I need to activate other threat systems that exist in this environment, help address the needs of this kid? And then there may be other concerns. What are other things you know about this kid that could potentially be relevant in determining what type of supervision or intervention they need? And so you get to the end of that, right? And then it says, here are some times you might want to think about requesting a level 2, right? So you can make that decision. Do we need to do a level 2? You might decide at that point, yeah, we've got enough of an indication now, we need to refer to a level 2. And that's where you would list kind of the outcome that had been done there. Here's the supervision plan. So in the supervision plan, we bolded those items that are included in most supervision plans. You don't have to include anything on this list at all, but these are all strategies that are commonly used and could potentially be used to help a kid with problematic sexual behavior. Starts off with individual options. So what are some things that we could do for that individual? Do we need to, number one is like, do we need to let the potential victim or the targeted individual know that there's some kind of targeted situation? And if there is, we've got a form that goes along with that helps you notify the parents of the child who's been targeted. Is there any kind of protective response that needs to be done with the security department? And then individual accountability plan, right? So what is the expectation that that kid has that's going to be made clear to them? Here's how your day is going to be different based on this, right? Like instead of maybe taking the bus to school, we're going to need your parents to get you to school and you're going to wait in the office until you go to your first class. That could be part of their individual accountability plan. But it's all the information that that kid is informed about that's going to be specific for them. And then it's got other things that might also be relevant: suicide assessment, threat assessment, fire setter assessment. And then it's got a bunch of school options. And these school options are all about different strategies a school could put in place depending upon the nature of the situation, right? So is there a need for bus supervision? Well, if that kid walks to school or is transported by parents, you wouldn't check that one, right? But if that kid rides the bus and you have concerns, there could be problematic behavior on the bus, which I got to tell you, having done this work for a while, there's so much problematic sexual behavior occurring on buses. Like, this is really those high back seats and the fact that the driver's got to attend, like a lot of stuff is going on in buses that require supervision. So gives you the mechanism to check that off and to specify what kinds of things need to be done. And it does that with all of these, right? And as you can see, the list is long. So you can go through each one and for each particular kid, decide which things are going to be most effective and which things are going to be least effective. And then it's got a bunch of family and home options. And these are all things that you would encourage parents to do for the kid, depending upon the nature of the situation, right? So it gives a bunch of different strategies that you can use with the parents. What we found is that this has been a really helpful thing for our schools and for juvenile justice, because what it allows juvenile justice to do in situations where they may not even necessarily be able to get involved, right? It allows schools to put parents on notice regarding what the expectations are for how to protect the community. And if the parents are not providing that level of supervision that is expected based upon what the school has made known to them, we've had situations where juvenile justice will go and get involved. They'll activate DHS, right? And say like, hey, these parents are not protecting the community. They're not doing what this kid needs to be done. So this can become a useful tool in terms of holding parents accountable and making sure that they're doing things to decrease the likelihood that the behavior is going to continue in the community. And then it's got other kinds of community options that could potentially be available. And obviously you guys would change these things as a function of what goes on in your community. You may have access to other things that we do not. We have access to things you may not. So consider this a living document. If you want a Word file of this, email me. I will send you a Word file so you can play with it and move it around. And then it's got information about who to contact if a level 2 is needed. And at the time I was in, right as I left, Shelley Rutledge, I don't think that's her number anymore. She was the person to contact. But you want to make sure that level 2 facilitator knows if this is going to a level 2. And then there's additional information that's gathered if it's going to a level 2. Is that student adjudicated? Are they a ward of the court? Are there other agencies involved? Are they a special ed kid? Are they in a self-contained classroom? Was the parent part of the level 1? Are parents supportive? All that kind of stuff goes on. And then you sign it and send it off. Now that may be all that's done, right? But at the end of this, you've got a mechanism to hold everyone accountable. Here's the team that signed up for it. And if you go back to that level 1, here's who's doing what, right? Here's the date it was assigned. Here's the responsible party. So everybody is signing off on what is going to be done for that kid and how often that information is going to be reviewed. So that's how that works. If you get done with that level 1 process and you're finding that, actually we're going to need a lot more support, then you take it to the level 2. And in that context, they're going to go through and work on that. Okay.
That's terrific. Thank you so much for that. That's great.
Oh, my pleasure. Other questions?
Yeah, Rebecca has a question. She wanted to know, how about communication between districts? So if a student has a situation at District A, how does District B become aware of that? Are the records transferred, or is there standard protocol for that?
Yeah, so here in Oregon, I'd say we've got a lot of school districts who are using CIRC now. And so if they are CIRC, Sexual Incident Response Committee is what it stands for, but using this model. And for the schools that are using it, they're always communicating to the districts that are receiving, okay? And so if you've got a kid who's been a part of this process, that information is going to go to the next school district. They're going to get that information so that they're able to set up a plan immediately. If the school is not participating in that, then, whether or not you get that kind of information, it could happen, it may not, and so I know oftentimes what we've encountered a lot of is parents will say, well, I really don't want this information to follow the kid to the new school. I want them to have a fresh start, right? Which I get, but on the other hand, that could also be a fresh new group of potential victims for problematic sexual behavior, right? So whenever we've got a kid who's been identified with having problematic sexual behavior through the system, that information is always communicated to the next district that's going to receive. It's a great question.
Terrific. Other questions?
I just want to say I really appreciate the presentation. We're going through a lot of situations such as these, not only in elementary, but middle and high school. Every situation is different. I know we have struggled. I'm with student services, so I'm the director of student support services, which I'm a little bit of both sides, making sure that I maintain due process according to education code, but also making sure that we establish the supports for our students. But it's just so, we just talked about one last week. It's just so difficult because absolutely, especially for elementary, parents don't want to believe that there's a problem on one side. And on the other side, you have parents that absolutely want you to just remove this child from the school. Absolutely not. This can never happen again. And it's really tough for administrators to be caught in the middle of that. So I really appreciate all the information that you provided for us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for that. One of the really wonderful things I think about this method too is that it allows all the different administrators to have a similar response, right? So this becomes a district-wide response rather than having to make it up on your own each time. And we've all read those headlines where like kid gets expelled for spanking a kid at school, right? And we're like, oh, this is crazy. But the reason it's crazy is because people don't have a methodology to refer to, right? And so they're oftentimes either caving to the interests of the parents who are very upset about the situation, or maybe they're ignoring it because the parents whose child was involved in this have a lot of sway. But when you have a method that is established, you can always refer back to that methodology. And I think it allows administrators to feel a lot more confident in their decision-making because they're following that system rather than just kind of making it up on their own. And my wife works in student services. I should have put this number up, but about 60% of the kids who are identified through this system are kids who are going to qualify for special ed services. So it really is like, this is a system needs to be in student services because a lot of these are gen ed kids too, right? And so you really need to have a system that's going to help both the kids who are gen ed and sped. And I think this does an elegant job of addressing all their needs in a way that's very systematized so that it's relatively free from bias and, a lot of, I think, thoughtfulness towards just the equity of making sure that we're applying all of this in a reasonable fashion rather than using just kind of bias or our own judgment to get involved in this. But thank you, Sonia. I'm glad you like this stuff.
Okay. I'm like Dora. I'm with Dora. This is Sonia we're in the same district. And so I was,
Dora, I'm sorry.
no, that's fine. In the chat I had mentioned around, if you're seeing, I'm curious about any cases recently about consensual sexual activity among students, maybe high school, middle school, I don't know, elementary, but that seems to trickle down into the school culture, right? You have students that maybe and I'm trying to think about it in similar ways of like how you mentioned, right? Like if there was a fight that occurred off campus and it trickles down to the school culture, right? So sort of how to navigate the sensitivity of that situation, right? And whereas typically if we would bring students together to do like conflict resolution,
right?
but if it's students that have engaged in sexual activity, it might be managed differently, or should it be managed? So sort of, I wonder if you've seen cases of that maybe recently, or I don't know.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think the issue you're talking about is like those things are occurring off campus, but it's leaking into the school culture, right? And so like kids are talking about it and about who's sexting who and who's sleeping with who and all this, and it's creating kind of this environment in which there's a lot of pervasive sexuality that's becoming a distraction for students, right? And when that is occurring, right, that is an issue that you can bring to this system, right? So for example, we've had situations where, we've got kids who are bringing a lot of this conversation to school. You sit down and have a conversation with them. Hey, look, this is pre-level 1, right? I'm having a conversation with you about this. Like, I understand if you're going to be sexually active or what have you, these are your own choices, provided, they're old enough and all that other kind of stuff. We want to encourage you to be safe and thoughtful and reasonable, but bringing these things to school is creating a problem. And I want to let you know that if that problem continues, here's what step 2 looks like, right? And step 2 looks like we're going to have a level 1. We're going to have mom and dad come in. We're going to have a conversation about this, right? And we're going to have a formal method of addressing this. It's nice, right? Because it gives you this solid tool and mechanism and system that you can now use to address that. And it's not like, well, I don't like it or I'm uncomfortable, right? Where that can create all kinds of difficulty. Now it's like, in our school, this isn't appropriate. We've got systems in place to address this, and you've just activated one. So we're going to take you through that system now, right? So what I found too is like when you're rolling out the system, it's great to have a lot of communication with the community, help them see what a tremendous benefit this is, right? Help them see that this is going to be a mechanism that will increase the safety in the schools, and also, and also let them know, I may be calling you sometime about these issues, and it's no reason to be upset. I'm not calling you to tell you there's something wrong with your kid. I'm calling you to solve a problem, right? I'm calling you to try to resolve something. So, so it can become a really elegant mechanism for dealing with those kinds of conversations that are leaking in. But like, if it's disrupting school, right, it's a problem. And this is a tool you can use to address that. Thank you, Sonia. Sorry about screwing up the names. Came up on my computer for some reason. Anyway, but my bad. Other questions?
So I have one question as well. You talk a lot about bias and thoughtfulness, and I keep thinking about the climate that we're in now and the impacts of subjectivity on how this topic can be viewed, especially as it relates to race, ethnicity, and LGBTQ plus populations.
Yep.
This seems like an opportunity to reduce subjectivity, but it also seems like it's full of landmines for schools. Maybe you can talk a little bit about like how this current climate is impacting this work, and how can schools avoid these landmines?
Yeah, we're seeing some really unprecedented times, right? I've seen those memes about like, I want to start living through precedented times again, because these unprecedented times are becoming really not fun. We've seen such a pushback against science, like we've never seen before. Teachers are leaving in droves because they're feeling like communities are not supportive. We've seen school districts and school boards, try to force superintendents to violate the law. It's just like, it's so crazy right now, right? What I would encourage more than anything is in using and implementing this model, the importance of transparency and talking to people about what this tool is for and how it is meant to be used. It is not a disciplinary tool. It is not meant to be used in a disciplinary fashion. This is not a tool that's designed to hurt or create problems. It's a tool that should be used to try to solve problems, right? So I think a lot of it is about trying to communicate with the parents and the faculty and the community, what this tool is designed to do and what it's not designed to do. My fear and my concern, and I've not seen this yet, but my fear and concern is that some yahooed administrator is going to use this as a mechanism to, in a disciplinary fashion, right? That's not what it's meant to be. It's meant to be a mechanism to help kids access the resources they need, but it certainly could be misused. So I think it's important for people who are using this methodology to be thoughtful about the fact that it's not meant to be disciplinary, to make sure that that's communicated to all parties who are using this, to be vigilant and looking for ways in which this could be potentially misused, because certainly this, like not unlike just about anything, right? This could potentially create a lot of harm if it's not implemented correctly. So it should always be implemented with a lot of communication with the community, with a lot of education, so that people can start to have a better understanding that problematic sexual behavior is not perversion or deviance or, whatever it is, pedophilia, whatever fear that everybody's generated around it. So I think there's a lot of other steps to go along with implementing this besides just putting it into your school. There's really a lot of work that needs to be done on the front end to try to help the community understand. But honest to God, that's gotten to be very complicated when a really big part of America is not listening to science anymore and sees science in general as suspicious, right? It's a tough time to try to create situations and conversations reasonably about the importance of a scientific methodology. So that is certainly, that's a huge problem, but it's one we're just going to continue to have to kind of fight. I mean, I've seen so many memes about like, what we thought science was like 200 years ago. And now it's like, yes, the moon does exist. Hey, the earth isn't flat. Birds are real. So didn't think we have to tell people these things, but here we are.
I also feel like there's some sort of assumption that parents are actually teaching their kids, but then the parents are also like, no, we don't want to. We're gonna force this. We're gonna make the schools do it. But then if the schools do it, we're gonna be upset with the schools for doing it.
Yes.
So it's just a weird dynamic that's ongoing, I feel like.
Yeah, don't teach my kids about sex because I want to not teach them about sex. Great. That's great. That's wonderful. That's really going to help our teen pregnancy rate if no one's talking to kids about sex. Great idea. Yeah.
Do others have questions before we let Dr. Kenney go? Well, Doctor, I appreciate this presentation. It was super informative.
Good.
And I'm sure since you volunteered some pro bono support, people are going to call you up and be like, hey, I want to talk to you about this.
Please do. I am not kidding. Call me up. I love talking about this stuff. I will do everything I can to help you. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And if anybody needs, I know the stuff is on Basecamp, but that's kind of tough to access sometimes. So if anybody needs either the PowerPoint or the PDF that he just shared, please let me know, and I can make sure I get that to you. Dr. Kenney, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I appreciate
Hey,
it.
it's my pleasure. Thank
All right.
you.
Thanks a lot.
Yep. Stay well. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. And I removed him from the hosting power, so the meeting won't shut down when he leaves. Hallelujah.
James, do you happen to have his email? Because I know he offered that last PDF as a Word document in case we want to modify it for our own.
Sure. Yes, I will send you all his PowerPoint. I'll send you his PowerPoint, the National Center for School PowerPoint, National Center for School Safety PowerPoint, as well as the PDF and his email address at the end when we leave. So I'll make sure I get that to everybody. And if you don't get it from me, email me. I'm going to put my email on there as well. And let me know you didn't get it. I have a list of most of you, so in case I missed you, just please let me know. All right, so closing thoughts, wrap up. You know, if folks, if we can pop back on so I can see all your lovely faces. Just wanted to get a sense of day one, how everybody's thinking, and then we'll do some preview of coming attractions for day two. Any overarching thoughts on day one, and you all want to share? All right, I'm sure it's been a long day. We're probably getting ready to get out of here, so that works. As a preview of coming attractions for tomorrow, you know, tomorrow I really want, hoping that we're all going to be super interactive. We're all going to be sharing about your site's activities for the first couple of years. My hope is that this is kind of as if we were all in a room together. You know, kind of a large square table where, you know, all the groups are going to be presenting. We'll have a block saved for presentations, a block saved for question and answers. And then at the end, you know, an additional time for Q&A for the sites that had presented. That's going to be it. You know, we're gonna hear from you all. So we're definitely looking forward to hearing about specific topics that you all are working on. If you're planning on presenting slides and moving the slides yourself, I'll be sure to give you guys the hosting power, and then make sure I remember to pull it back at the end. So you guys can have the hosting power, just have your PowerPoint deck up and ready, so that you can move the slides yourself. Other than that, I don't have anything else. Is anybody last chance before we adjourn for the day and we start again tomorrow at noon? All right, hearing none, thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow, and I'll send you guys the decks and the email information. Take care.
Good night.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.